Thank you, Ryan. Am I on? Gilbert Chesterton once said, "The whole object of travel is not to set foot on foreign land. It is at last to set foot on one's own country as a foreign land." This is something that became a foundation for my travels across the country, wanting to set out, be a foreigner in the United States, try new things, meet new people, and everything else. Another big inspiration was a fellow named Packy. Packy's the owner of a pub called The Boot in London. And I was studying abroad through an MSU program several years ago, and I did a photography program and documented Packy's life, learned about him growing up in Ireland, moving to England, starting a pub. And he really took me under his wing. He showed me some great things around London, and we built this real personal connection. So as I was approaching graduation from MSU, I was looking back and realized that as much as we encourage students to study abroad, we rarely encourage them to explore their own country, which is something I heavily wanted to do. And in addition, I looked back on my experience with Packy and decided I wanted to take this experience and recreate it over and over and over again across the United States. And from there, a road trip was born. Between 2006 and 2007, I took a 50-state journey across the country. I road tripped to the lower 48 and flew to both Alaska and Hawaii. I drove 29,000 miles, but that doesn't include time spent in trains, planes, and boats. And if you look at all the time throughout the trip, I spent 1/12 of my entire year in some mode of transportation. So that's on average of 2 hours per day, or across the full year, a full month of my entire year was spent in some kind of vehicle. A big goal of the trip was to, of course, document as much as possible. I took nearly 12,000 photographs, wrote nearly 400 blog entries about the people I had met, the adventures I'd been on, and my perspectives of America. But at its core of everything, the idea of the trip was to really stay with people across the country I'd never met before. I moved into 114 households consisting of 294 strangers, all people I had never met, and some very strange strangers, but all good people. And, as I was moving my way across the country, it was a pretty grueling pace. On average, I picked up my duffel bag every 2.8 days and headed to a new household. What I realized as I was going across the country is I knew very little about these folks. I maybe knew their career, how old they were, what their family situation was, but that was about it, if I knew that much at all. I rarely knew what kind of neighborhood I was going to be driving into, if I was staying at an apartment, a house, a mansion, a church, or a record shop. And because, don't get me wrong, these weren't just households and not just beds. There was the record shop and a church. I stayed in a pool house. I slept on one kitchen floor. It was a good night. And I was disappointed that there was only one waterbed on the whole trip. But that's how it goes. So, at the core of the trip, I really realized that it's all about the people, and it doesn't matter where you are. And, TEDx is an awesome example of how that works. People often assumed that my stops in Hawaii or Miami, New York City were going to be the best stops of the trip. And sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. But at the end of the day, if you're staying with some boring, kind of miserable people in Hawaii, you're not going to have that great of a time. But if you're in the middle of North Dakota with a bunch of tumbleweeds, and you're with dynamic, interesting, enthusiastic people, you're going to have a much better time in North Dakota than you will in Hawaii. So to highlight a few, I stayed on a ranch in southeast Montana. This was a 6,000-acre cattle ranch. I helped trail the cattle back from the land each day, did some daily chores. I stayed in Milpitas, California with a a cappella producer, and we spent one morning cutting a track in his home studio. I did not do the singing. And there are some guys I met in Dallas, Texas, who build these rockets out of this large warehouse, and they compete in rocket competitions across the world, and just so lots of intriguing people. And as many people as there were, and so many stories, I really tried to narrow it down to some key stories that kind of changed my life, my perspective on life, since traveling. Early on in the trip, this is only the 7th day of the trip. I leave from the Upper Peninsula and arrive in Fox Lake, Illinois. I'm staying with a married couple, about 50, no kids, and it starts as a very typical start. You know, I arrive at my host. They show me around the house, the guest bedroom and the kitchen, offering me a glass of water. And within 30 minutes, it's just me and the wife at the house, and the telephone rings. And on the other end of this telephone, I hear this frantic woman in tears, clearly have gone through something traumatic. And the woman on the phone, her husband had just been murdered. And at this point, I had just met, the man who was murdered was a very close cousin of the host I was staying with. And at this point, I'm shocked, a little startled, and not knowing what to do at all with this woman I had just met and known for 30 minutes. And I offered her a hug when she got off the phone, and within another half an hour, I had moved on to get out of their way so they could grieve and move on to the next house, and had to, reshift, some of my plans. But it was a very quick wake-up call off the bat, realizing this trip wasn't just about sightseeing, and that it was, a deep and permanent change that really takes place inside of me. So being a little startled, I shook it off, and the trip got rolling again, and eventually I arrived in White Bear Lake, Minnesota. I stay with this awesome, awesome family of 4, one of the best hosts of the trip. They've got 2 teenage daughters. The husband and father works in the marketing department at a local community college, and the mom works out of the house. And they scheduled some great things while I was in town. We toured around Minneapolis and St. Paul. It was high school homecoming week, so we lived out that American tradition. And, 2.8 days was the average, so eventually it was time to move on again. And it was my last night in White Bear Lake. And I was up late printing directions for my drive to South Dakota the next day. And I could smell something, or maybe I was lightheaded, but something wasn't right. And the mom came down, and she sort of agreed, and we called 911. 911 suggested we get out of the house immediately, so we do. And when they arrived, they said without a doubt the house was filling up with carbon monoxide. So here I am going through all this again, only the 23rd day of my trip. But what they said when they came back out of the house, they took a reading of the levels, and that another 30 to 60 minutes in the house, and the 5 of us probably would have passed out and never woken up again. So I'm pretty startled again at this point, and shook up and wondering how many of these types of things am I going to experience on this trip. But for one, it really pulls you very, very close, with these strangers. And it was a turning point on the trip in terms of how I approached the trip. Because I looked at it that it was no longer staying with strangers, and it was staying with friends I hadn't yet met. And the rest of the trip went pretty smooth. Eventually, I arrived in Boise, Idaho, became best friends with this group of college students. We ate 2-pound hamburgers. We dressed up as gangrene for Halloween. We went shooting trap and skeet. And, of course, you can't go to Boise without attending a game at the famous Smurf turf. So I was staying with Teddy and Christy, a young boyfriend and girlfriend who were living together, and it was Christy who invited me to stay for the week, or Teddy who invited me to stay for the week. And little did I know at the time how upset Christy was for Teddy having me over, because Christy's mom, Nancy, was in town that same week. So the 3 of them were supposed to be spending this week together, and little did they know this stranger roaming along the country would, stop at their door. But they decided to put up with me, and within the first hour or 2, we hit it off and became best friends. And it became this very memorable week. And I think a lot of kind of philosophies in life are maybe even more true on the road and in travel. And one of those that I've always believed is that most of our regrets in life come from things we didn't do rather than the things we did. And this was one of those weeks, if they had passed it up, that's the most memorable week of the trip that would have never happened. And, if we've got a family member that's coming through town, an old friend, put them up in your house, have a fun week. It might be crazy, but there'll always be good stories to tell for the rest of your life, rather than if they're in a hotel. So I had moved on through over half the trip. I had arrived in Gulfport, Mississippi, and this was a little untypical stop because I wasn't staying with a family or any people, and my host was an actual church. This church sat 2 blocks off the coast and was destroyed by Katrina a year and a half earlier. And it had a big impact on the country, and as everybody knows, and it was interesting to see the perseverance and the change this community had to go through to readjust. And they're currently, or at the time, they were worshiping out of a makeshift sanctuary in a big warehouse. And I got close with a couple elderly couple. They still send tangerines to my parents every year. But when I look back on it, if I was staying in hotels across the country, I would have never gained this firsthand experience, of what these people went through and how their lives changed. And I see that as kind of a core rule of my traveling now, is that, to avoid hotels and to stay with people as much as possible. So then there was Gladys. And Gladys is a sweet little woman. She is awesome. I'm really happy to say that I actually spoke with Gladys on the phone earlier this week. She's doing great. She's 81 years old now, and she lives in the little town in Milton in the little state of Delaware. And Gladys has lived in the same house her entire life. She was born in that house, lives there 81 years later. Every morning she still has a wood stove that she maintains and a small chicken coop in the barn. And she lives completely independently, free of medication. But what really interested me about Gladys was that Gladys has never left the state of Delaware, a very small state. And so often, I think we romanticize travel and we kind of give, maybe extra credit points to travelers, and we see them as being very knowledgeable. But Gladys has got a completely different perspective of life. And she's extremely content, the most content person I know, and living in that little town, and she has everything she needs in that community, and it's right around what's around us in our immediate, area, that's what's most important. And, talking about the knowledge of travelers and those types of things, Gladys was brilliant. She was as witty as can be, as quick as a whip, and she will, argue political points, and extremely knowledgeable of what's going on in the world. And I really appreciate the experience I had with Gladys, and she taught me a lot, and she's just an awesome, awesome woman. So I had been all across the country at this point. The trip was finishing up, and I had seen a very rosy picture of the country. There's no doubt about that. I saw some incredible things, met incredible people, but despite that rosy picture, I'm confident to say that rosy picture of America is a far more accurate picture of the country than what we see on the evening news on a regular basis. And it was throughout the trip, I was continually in places I had never been, with people I had never met, doing things I had never done. And, it was quick for the unfamiliar to become the familiar, and the familiar, the unfamiliar. And I encourage us all to seek out the unfamiliar in life and find friends amongst strangers. Thank you.